Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this video I want to be a masterclass in environmental variables, but not just in like Node, but also in Python and Ruby. Just what the concept of environmental variables are, because a lot of people work with them, but I don't think a lot of people really appreciate what's going on when you're using environmental variables, especially if you're like a newer developer. It's just kind of like this arbitrary thing, and it's a way to hide your data. But basically, the kind of put in the context, what's happening is that when you run things in your operating system, whether it's Mac, Windows, Linux, okay, you're technically running whatever process in your operating system within a shell environment. Okay, so even if you click like an icon on your desktop, technically under the hood, a shell is being created, like a terminal, and the command saying run this program is being run, and that program's running in that context, in that little wrapper. And that little wrapper, okay, your shell, has access to all sorts of information about your computer. Okay, these are called environmental variables. They're variables that don't exist in your code. Like, you didn't write them down in your code. Your code has access to them because your code is executed by the shell of the computer that it's on. So again, when you, like, for example, we're thinking in JavaScript, so let me just do a quick JavaScript file. Okay, usually, when we think about scope, okay, if I create a variable here, const cheese equals 5, it's available here. I can console.log cheese. Okay, basically a scope that a child context has access to its parent's information. So essentially there's the shell, that's a process, and your code is being run within that shell. So essentially it's like a child scope. So it has access to that parent scope. Okay, so the beauty of that is now you can store data somewhere that's not in your actual written code, and that's great for security purposes. Also useful for when you need certain things to be consistent between certain programs. They can all pull like the same variables. But every programming language that runs in terminal, which is pretty much all of them, okay, because they have to run somewhere, okay, there's a runtime that's running them. The only one that kind of gets excluded of this is like JavaScript in the browser, because JavaScript in the browser is technically kind of running several sort of, basically really the shell's running the browser, and then the browser is running the tab, and then the tab is running your code. So there really isn't necessarily a mechanism that, or at least one that I'm aware of that they've done, where they're passing down those environmental variables down that low or making them accessible. They could make them accessible. Usually when you write web code, you're writing it to run on someone else's computer. So you're not depending on there being variables that exist on their computer. So there really isn't a need for that. The difference is, like, when you're writing a node in JavaScript, you're going to be running it on a computer that you configured, your server. Okay, which is why it makes sense. Okay, so main takeaway so far is that, again, your code that you write runs within the context of the shell, aka your operating system. Okay, that shell has several variables that exist within it that then thus become available to your program. And these are what's called environmental variables. They're variables that exist within the environment that your code is running in. Okay, so for example, I could define a variable in my bash shell. So here I'm using bash. If you're using Zush, this will also work. If you're using like PowerShell, then this probably might look different. But in bash, you can export and declare a variable. So I'll say export cheese equals Gouda. Okay. I should probably do that differently. Let's get rid of these spaces. Export cheese equals Gouda. There we go. Okay. Now let me confirm that I actually declared this variable. So what I can do is I can echo the variable. It's like a console log in bash. So I'll echo cheese. Okay, Gouda. Okay, so the variable exists. It's in my shell environment. Now I'm going to run this JavaScript file through Node. Okay, so I'm running it in Node currently. Because again, there's two ways to run JavaScript files now through your shell, Node and deno. But if I run it in Node, the environmental variables are made available through the process object. The process object represents that, hey, technically your code that's being run is running as part of a process, meaning there's a thing the computer is doing, and each thing the computer is doing is a process, and your script is one of them. And all the details of that process, okay, basic details of the environment, are provided to your script via this process object. Okay, so I can go process.env, that's where all the environmental variables are going to be made available. So I can now do .cheese. Okay, and if I run it in this shell, I'm running it in this particular shell. So if I were to open up another terminal, the variables that I had created all disappear because it's a separate shell. I didn't redefine it within that execution context. So it's a separate scope. It's kind of like if you run your code multiple times. So in that case, if I say node scratch.js, okay, oops, I didn't actually console log it. So, but we can get an error. So the value exists. Okay, but if we do that, let's console log it. Okay, we can see that Gouda exists. Awesome. Now, let's say I decide to run this in Node. In Node, not in Node, in deno, deno doesn't provide you this process object. It does it through the deno object. Now, let's see here. So I think if I remember right, it's like deno.env .cheese, like that. So it'd just be like that. It might even be like .get cheese, but we'll see. We'll see in a second. Okay, so then if I wanted to run the file, if I were to say deno scratch.js, I'm pretty sure it's going to give me an error because I'm pretty sure you have to give a flag to use environmental variables. Because deno, everything's like shut off by default, and you have to pass the flags to use different features. Okay, yep, scratch, so it doesn't like deno. Oh, it's like deno run. That's right. It's like deno run scratch.js. Undefined. Okay, because I get that's. So let's do this. So first, let's do deno.env. Okay, yep, it's a getter. So there's a get function. So we say dot get, and I want to get cheese from the environment. Okay, yep. It's complaining because I didn't unlock envs, because again, deno is all about security. So they're like, hey, you know what? We're not going to let you pull data from the environmental variable, edit files, use the internet, unless you said you want that to be the case. The reason is because in Node, everything is just allowed from the get-go, and you might run something that edits files on your computer, uses the internet in a weird way. So deno was kind of made with like security in mind. So deno --allow -env is the flag, as it says so in the error. And if I do that, scratch.js. That's the one annoying thing about deno, is like you end up having to pass like all these flags, although there's like an allow all flag if I remember correctly. Okay, and it still doesn't like it. How did I use it wrong? Run again with the allow. What did I do? Oh, I forgot the word run. Run. There we go. And see, it has access to the environment. So these are two different runtimes. Deno and Node are two different things, and they both have access to that variable called Gouda. Every language, every runtime has a way to access those variables. Let's try a different language. Let's do Python. So scratch.py. Okay, so in here, if I remember correctly, to access the environmental variables in Python, you have to import a library called OS, and then let's print, and I think it's like os.environ, there we go, .get. So it's kind of like deno, where you have to like use this getter function, and then I can be like here and say, hey, I'd like to get cheese, and let's run that. So that would be Python scratch.py, and see, two different languages, and they both have access to the same variable, because the variable doesn't exist in Python, it doesn't exist in JavaScript, it exists in the operating system, it exists in this, and not even just in the operating system, in this particular execution of the shell. Okay. Again, if I were to open up another terminal, so I'm going to open up another terminal. Okay, so now I have two terminals. Now if I try to run that same script in the second terminal, Python scratch.py, I get none because I declared that variable, that whole export command I did earlier, in this shell, so it only exists there. It doesn't automatically exist over here. These are two separate shell instances of the shell environment, and they're not aware of the other. Okay. This is why you put things in like your bash RC or your zush RC or whatever the equivalent is for PowerShell. Things that are going to kind of load up variables and the path kind of at startup of a terminal, of a shell. Okay. But I think we're starting to kind of see the point. Again, there's variables that exist outside of your code. Okay? Because a lot of people always think like you'll use things like .env files or other ways of creating environmental variables, and people oftentimes think that like it knows the variable is an environmental variable because it's in a .env file. It doesn't need to be in a .env file. A .env file is just a convention of how to normally store your environmental variables in a file, and you usually use some sort of third-party library that reads those and then adds them into the environment for you. Okay, or makes them accessible as if they were environmental variables. Okay, let's try Ruby. So scratch.ruby. Okay, this, if I remember correctly, it should be like PENV, and then there's like a hash with all the environmental variables, cheese. So it should just be that. So let's try that out. So that'd be ruby scratch.rb. Yep, and see, we got access to the variable, so it worked. Okay. Let's try out some other ones. PHP. Scratch.php. This one I'm not quite sure if I remember how to access environmental variables. I think it's also, let's see here, so it's just going to be like PHP. And then I think this would be echo. And then I do think also here it's env. Yeah, there we go, env. And then I think we would then just pass in the key. Cheese. And then we need to do a semicolon. Okay, and let's run that. PHP scratch.php. Enable the load dynamic layer, blah, blah, blah. Module of the string, I don't care about any of that. Unidentify array key cheese. Okay. That's all fine. I don't care about those warnings. Let's look it up. Just don't remember it off the top of my head. Okay, accessing and variables in PHP, because we're going to do a few languages. I want you to know that you basically, whatever language you have, there's just a way to access them. Okay, so it is in here. But am I thinking about this wrong? Okay. No, I'm thinking about it right. Okay. Okay. So am I running it in the wrong terminal? Let's go back to over here. Let's see here. Which terminal am I running this in? Echo cheese. Yeah, Gouda. So this is the right terminal. Undefined array key cheese. Something I'm missing in how they use it. Cheese. I think we need to use this. Get env. Okay, get env gets the value of an environmental variable. So get env string. Yeah. Okay, there we go. That's what I'm looking for. VS Code. Get env cheese. Let's see here. Does that give me what I wanted? Yes. See, there we go. We accessed it. Okay, let's try Perl. Scratch dot. I think it's, yeah, Perl. Okay. So let's see here. Perl environmental variables. Okay. There we go. Cool. So it should just be, we'll create a variable called, just make it the thing equals, let me just read that again, equals, yep. There you go. Equals env, and then we would say cheese, put a semicolon, and then we would print the thing, and then semicolon for Perl. Perl scratch.pl package cheese. Scratch. Let's see here. Assign env. Oh, there's a dollar sign there. Boop. There we go. And there we go. Gouda. Okay. Gouda. Let's try maybe one more language. But you guys get the point. The point is you can, like, whatever language there is, there's a way. So like those environmental variables, they just exist. And the cool thing is you can define them when you write the script. So let's just go back to JavaScript because that's kind of like where things are most natural. Okay, so let's say I want to define another one called bread. So process.env.bread. Okay, I don't have to do it. I don't have to export it into this terminal shell. I can actually make the environmental variable only exist for this particular command. And the way you do that is you define the variables before the command. So I can say bread equals rye. Okay, bread equals rye. And then I just do node scratch.js. And see, I get rye. But if I do that command again, but I take out the thing again, this environmental variable was already like erased the minute that command finished. Then see, it's undefined again. So as we saw here, by using the export command, okay, I was able to make that environmental variable part of this shell instance, and it just existed no matter how many commands I did. By defining it at the beginning of the command, it existed just for that command. And now if I wanted to make it exist all the time, I'd have to manipulate like configuration files. So in bash, it'd be like the bash rc, or for zush, the zush rc. Those configuration files. So basically what happens is when you deploy your app to like another server, whether it's a VPS or Netlify or Render or Heroku or any of these Linode, DigitalOcean, AWS, Google Cloud, you guys get the point. You have to define the environmental variables there as well. If you're using a virtual private server, you can just SSH into it and just define them like you would on your own computer through the terminal. But then oftentimes, you know, you don't necessarily have that level of access, so they usually give you some sort of panel where you can define those. But they're just variables that exist within the shell environment in which your code is being executed. And that's the main point. That's all it is. Sounds simpler than it probably has felt throughout this video, but once that really sits, it's pretty powerful and pretty useful. And you'll be able to be much more nimble in being able to like, get the environmental variables you need available to you when you need to get them available to you. So that's all. I just really kind of want to focus on that. Again, .env files. Usually it's just some sort of library, third-party library that you install. It doesn't have to be .env files, but you can do anything for your environmental variables. YAML files, TOML files, JSON files. You just need to have some library that reads the file and then injects them into your environment. Yeah. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcode.com. Do subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And I'll see you all when I see you. Ciao. Make sure you follow me on Twitter and stuff. Yay.